Aurel Braun joins me. He's a Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto. Thank you very much for your time. Now, while sanctions have hurt the Russian economy, it hasn't stopped the war. Is the only answer now to pile Ukraine with more weapons? The heavier the better?
This seems to be the trend, and it indicates the kind of miscalculation that Vladimir Putin has engaged in. He had virtually unlimited international ambitions, but it turns out that Russia has very limited capabilities. He has not succeeded in conquering Ukraine and imposing a government to his liking. It has been 2 months, as was pointed out, and the Russian forces have not done particularly well. But worse than that, Vladimir Putin managed to have a dormant NATO reawaken. And this is a reawakening of a giant. Russia cannot match the military might of NATO, and this alliance now is prepared to provide Ukraine with massive help. And this is one of the factors in the visit by Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and by General Austin, the Secretary of Defense. This is a bad day for the Kremlin, just as the victory by a landslide of Emmanuel Macron over Marine Le Pen, who is much more favorably inclined toward the Kremlin, is also a huge loss.
So as you say, $800 million in military spending coming Ukraine's way. That's something that Zelensky has been asking for since the beginning in terms of heavy weaponry to fight Russia. Why was Biden so reluctant to supply Ukraine with the weapons it so clearly needed at the very beginning?
There appeared to have been a kind of intimidation factor, where Vladimir Putin projected this image of an invincible Russian army that had crushed the Georgians in 2008, an army that was able to take over Crimea with little resistance, as well as parts of the eastern Donbass, an army that was able to save the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But it turns out that this military, which was able to be successful against very weak opponents, does not do very well when it is hit back. And the Ukrainians have fought back with amazing determination and with tremendous skill. And so what Mr. Biden therefore had to recognize is that the United States and NATO had overestimated Russia. And as time went by, they lost some of that timidity. And now they're beginning to bring in the kind of armaments, including heavy armaments, that they had been reluctant to provide Ukraine with in the past.
You mentioned Russia's miscalculations there. How and why has Russia miscalculated this war and its consequences? For example, one of the ideas was to stop NATO expansion, and here we are with Finland and Sweden considering to join the alliance.
This is a kind of irony, in a way, for the Kremlin, that Mr. Putin proclaimed that his fear was NATO enlargement. I think it was much more complicated than that. And his invasion of Ukraine, whatever the ultimate outcome is, even if he should be able to turn it around right now, NATO is not going to be the same organization. NATO now is spending massively. Take Germany, for example. Germany had basically lost the ability to project any kind of military power. Their military was in terrible shape. Now they're going to spend massively. Germany allowed itself to become economically dependent on energy from Russia. They are moving away from their dependence, perhaps not fast enough, but they are definitely moving away from that. And as you mentioned, two neutral states that desperately wanted to have good relations with Russia now are very seriously considering membership in NATO. And even if they do not become members of NATO, they are cooperating closely with NATO, and that cooperation, at the very least, will strengthen.
It's unlikely that Putin will bring his troops home without some kind of a win. What does Russia need to do to succeed in this next phase of the attack? What have they learned, or do they need to learn to put in a properly resourced and coherent effort to secure the East and potentially the South too?
It's really difficult to define what would be considered a win, because even though the sanctions are not very effective right now, over the longer term, they will badly damage a very vulnerable Russian economy. This is an economy that is not a very modern one. It's energy dependent, and it doesn't produce much beyond energy and weapons that is in any way competitive internationally. And so that will gradually percolate within the population that they are paying a very high economic price. The casualty figures will start coming in, and more people will begin to question just what was won. And so it's conceivable that Vladimir Putin may be able to gain a land bridge from Crimea to the eastern Donbass and hold on to a larger portion of Donbass. That would still leave most of Ukraine intact. It is also the case that in the longer term, Ukrainians have proven not only that they are a separate people, that there is a genuine Ukrainian identity, but that identity now has become very anti-Russian. There's no way that Vladimir Putin can rebuild the Russian Empire. So strategically, there is no winning for Vladimir Putin.
Really appreciate your insight there. Aurel Braun, International Relations and Political Science Professor at the University of Toronto.